Hi, I'm your host Vasco Duarte. Welcome to the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast, where we share tips and tricks from Scrum Masters around the world. Every day, we bring you inspiring answers to important questions that all Scrum Masters face day after day. Hello, everybody. Welcome to one more week of the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast. And this week, joining us from Denver in the US is Chuck Durfee. Hey, Chuck, welcome to the show.
Good morning. Thanks, Vasco. I'm really excited to be here.
It's a pleasure to have Chuck here today. He's going to take a different perspective than we usually take. Chuck is an engineering manager in the Denver area. He leads teams to deliver quality software on time and within budget. He has expertise as a Scrum Master and Agile coach, and he uses relationships, teamwork, and a pragmatic approach to solve complex business problems. In this episode, we will explore his perspective as an engineering leader and learn what makes great Scrum Masters from the perspective of people that take leadership positions like he does. Chuck, that was a short intro. Tell us a little bit more about yourself and how did you end up in the position of a dev manager?
Oh, yeah. I have been in the IT field for almost 30 years now. I started out as a support engineer and then was a developer for a number of years. Found that I really enjoyed Scrum. One of my engineering managers asked me to pilot Scrum there. He'd read an article on the internet, which was kind of novel at the time. And then I've been doing Agile software development for close to 20 years now. As you mentioned, I had some time in there as an enterprise Agile coach as well. But I found myself as I became a developer more and more in team leadership roles, and that led me to go back to school and get an MBA and go into management. My first job as a manager, I learned a lot for sure. I was put in a position where I was managing a team in Boulder, which is a small town near here that's known for technology. And I was also managing a team in Munich, Germany. So I got to learn a lot about how to manage people remotely during that time, which has been wonderful since the COVID pandemic started. So it's an interesting journey. I'm excited to share with you.
Absolutely. And we'll dive right into that journey. Of course, our listeners are also Scrum Masters and Agile coaches like you were back then. Yeah. And therefore, we're very eager to hear about your perspective from the point of view of the leader. So share with us from all the teams, all the Scrum Masters and coaches that you've worked with, what might be like one of the biggest mistakes that you've seen Scrum Masters and coaches do. We want to explore that, of course, so that we learn and try to avoid that kind of mistake. But let's explore that story first. Tell us the story of what was going on, what was the context, and what were the things as they unrolled that led you to understand, okay, there was a big problem going on.
Yeah. I was thinking about this question and I was recalling a time when I was a Scrum Master, but it was formational to be becoming a dev manager. I was a team lead and I was a Scrum Master for a company that had never done software before. They were a hardware manufacturer and decided to get into the software market. So I was hired to lead this team and help them not only with how to do software development, but Agile as well. There were a couple of executives that I was working with very closely in that role. They were trying to figure out what to expect from this project. And I spent a lot of time just doing basic Agile teaching of not only the team, but these executives as well. And I learned a lot about communicating with executives through that role and definitely made some mistakes. One was I didn't come at it as well as I should have with beginner's mind. So I was assuming some knowledge and some understanding of what this process was like. In hardware development, for example, design is the thing that takes the longest. They spend a lot of time in manufacturing engineering, making sure that circuits have certain tolerance and so forth. And then once the design is figured out, the implementation is really fast, which is the opposite of the way it is in software, right? You have an idea of what you want your design to be, and then as you start implementing that design, that's where the challenges and complications come. I had a really difficult time explaining that to them, and if I had to do it over again, I think I would have given them more of an experiential experience of what Scrum was rather than talking about it as theory. And the great Scrum Masters that I deal with have always got a way to find some touchstone with the people that they're talking about to make Agile really resonant with them.
Give us an example, Chuck, of what might have been something that gave you the insight. Okay, there's a gap here. Maybe I'm assuming too much. Like, can you give us an example?
Yes, one of the executives that I was dealing with was very skeptical, shall we say, about Agile, and it was when he started asking questions and made it pretty clear that he didn't understand really what we were trying to build, and started talking about his. I finally had the insight to ask him, what his experience of projects was, and that's where I learned a lot about hardware development. Actually, was him describing what a project normally looked like to him. So I would just urge Scrum Masters to be curious and continue to ask questions and make sure that they understand the other person's perspective if what they're trying to say doesn't seem to be landing.
Absolutely. And that's actually a great point, right? Like when you said I didn't come at it with beginner's mind, it didn't cross my mind. But now as you explained the example, I understand that what you meant is to be able to understand others, we have to have questions for them. Like we have to want to know what they think, and we have to hear their perspective, right? Like it's, as you said, in this case, like just asking, so what does a project normally look like for you, right? And once you got that information, you could see the contrast, because you could say, okay, that's not how it looks like for me, right? And before you asked that question, you were just, I don't know, but that's what I imagined, that you were just making assumptions that they would accept that design is a short part. Even requirements is a very short part of what is a long implementation project. And of course, when they explained what they thought was a project, you understood that that's actually not possible, right?
Yeah, exactly. It was through talking about what the project plan that I had come up with in conjunction with my project manager was going to look like, and they were starting to ask questions that made it clear that they didn't understand why certain things were going to go the way they were. And I had to peel back those assumptions that I was making till I got to a point where we had some common ground.
So asking questions like this is one way, but have you found other ways to help you stay grounded in that beginner's mind, especially when you're talking to people that you might not have a lot of information about their background?
Um, Yes, although I tend to really lean heavily on asking questions and remaining curious as opposed to making judgments or assumptions, in part because of the story that I just told you. Another way that I found that's really helpful is to lean on material that I've prepared before that has worked well. So I've used past successes in order to jumpstart this process. So, for example, I'm these days I'm teaching more Kanban than kind of basic Scrum. A lot of people have a good grounding in Scrum, but there are times when people want to do things a little differently. And there's a board game actually called GetKanban that I've used a number of times in order to teach basic Kanban principles. I would do the same thing with Scrum, I think, if I were asked to teach Scrum these days. Uh, but it goes through and it has a lot of those mind frame setting pieces where you are you're a team, you're delivering software and so forth, and it lays it all out. And I found that that's really helpful when you're trying to present any sort of materials to lay out the basic foundation of what you're going to try to do and make sure that everybody's on the same page before you start. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. Great example. And I think the reference you meant you gave us to experiential learning, which is not necessarily an easy thing to master, but there are concrete things we can do, like, for example, using existing board games, or there's a lot of examples, like there's the pizza game also by some folks who are also trying to kind of formalize how to teach Kanban to people. There's the Lego game, which you can use to teach the basic concepts of Scrum, should that be necessary, and so on. And that's a very practical way to bring experiential learning into the interaction with the community, right? Stakeholders, teams, everybody.
Absolutely. And there's a question later that will touch back on this topic.
Yeah, absolutely. For now, thank you very much for sharing this story. I'm looking forward to dive more into your experience here, Chuck.
Thank you. Have a good Monday.
Monday is about what we learn from our obstacles and our failures. But tomorrow is Team Tuesday here on the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast. We explore teams and their journeys, the habits they develop that threaten their performance, how each of our guests help their teams evolve, and the one key lesson they learned from that experience. We really hope you liked our show. And if you did, why not rate this podcast on Stitcher or iTunes? Share this podcast and let other Scrum Masters know about this valuable resource for their work. Remember that sharing is caring.